you just joined us, my name's Michael and I'm your CPD Live host for this 60-minute IIA webinar, The What, Why and How, What Causes Team Toxicity by Grievous Beard. Now for those who don't know Grievous Beard is a skilled and experienced workplace investigator, accredited mediator and engaging trainer and speaker. As one of two founding directors of WorkLogic, he assists his clients to minimize and manage the risk of poor behavior in the workplace across Australia and beyond. With decades of experience in advising employers to prevent, navigate and minimize conduct risk and dysfunctional team dynamics, Grievous and his WorkLogic co-founder, Rose Bryant-Smith, have created a vital resource for managers and internal advisors. Grievous, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm just opening up your mic. Good morning.
Good morning, Michael. Thanks for having me.
There we are. Pass control to you. Enjoy the webinar, everyone.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Institute of Internal Auditors for having me this morning. So today, a bit less than a 60-minute journey through the what, why and how, what causes team toxicity, and certainly happy to answer any questions you might have, but if possible, I usually like to leave particular questions to the end of our session today. So in terms of what we're going to be looking at today, it's basically, I suppose, yes, what is team toxicity? What does it look like? Why does it happen? And what we can do about trying to engage with that type of toxicity, particularly, I suppose, around the fact that most concerns that affect people happen at team level, and managers of teams need to think about what they can do to manage that people risk effectively. And certainly as part of that, part of the presentation today will be me looking at giving you the quick whip through 7 golden rules of procedural fairness when one of the tools that a manager or HR or the organisation might need to implement is a workplace investigation. So in terms of, I suppose, having a look through the learnings for today, it's going to be obviously looking at what can be some of the common situations that affect team dynamics, cause conflict, prevent the team from being the best it can. We're certainly also going to be looking at some of the appropriate solutions and tools that you can implement to explore and identify how better to run your team if you are a manager of a team. And I suppose particularly for today taking into account that the audience is, I imagine, not only internal auditors across Australia and New Zealand, but also potentially auditors who are also managers of staff or might have some other hats that they wear, and or if people are wearing HR as one of their hats, then certainly this should also resonate for you. And as I mentioned before, I think that it's really helpful to brush up on when we are needing to identify if people have behaved inappropriately and potentially breached codes of conduct for the workplace, breached their values, that we explore and investigate that situation in a procedurally fair way so that we don't cause more problems in the very fact of trying to come to grips with what is the truth as to whether behaviour that's problematic has occurred or not. So in terms of looking at team toxicity, I was quite fascinated actually to see that the definition of toxic, as I've said out there, don't we love the Oxford English Dictionary, well basically the word itself, toxic, what does it mean? It's really about harmfulness. It's about something that's unpleasant, very bad, toxic, a toxic relationship, a toxic team member, a toxic environment. It's actually basically something which is literally poisonous, harmful or injurious to health. And fascinating, I suppose, to see that there we are, the origins of that word really come back to definitions relating to the word toxicum, poison, which then goes back to somehow a Greek root all about arrows that themselves might be poisoned. So reflecting a bit philosophically on that, in years and centuries gone by, clearly physical harm was often at the forefront of when human beings might have engaged in inappropriate ways towards each other. In the modern and contemporary workplace, I would suggest that, yes, whilst physical harm, physical trickiness that happens in a workplace environment is covered off by OH&S, really, quite frankly, this emerging issue of psychological safety and how we actually ensure that we have an environment that is not psychologically harmful to other people is, I suppose, really one of the burning issues of modern workplace best practice. And why is it important? Well, apart from hopefully being pretty obvious, I've set out there on that slide here the fact that really toxicity in the workplace has so many appalling consequences, not only at an individual level, obviously people feeling, yes, I do actually want to be part of this team, I want to get up in the morning and go to work, obviously where things are happening that are problematic and it can affect the way the team itself functions as a unit. It can affect all sorts of things, including efficiency of the team, the morale of the team, the discretionary effort of the team, and to be honest, in its most severe forms, whether the team can continue to function at all. Are people actually becoming either psychologically absent or actually physically absent from the workplace? Are they bowing out? Are they leaving the organisation? And of course, you can appreciate, I'm sure, particularly in your roles as auditors, what looks like best practice and how we need to make sure that compliance with appropriate standards is going to help with the team's productivity. Certainly when people are behaving badly and there's potential conduct risk issues or people risk issues, that can bleed into all sorts of other consequences. You can have legal ramifications when people who behave badly might be breaching OH&S laws or bullying, anti-bullying laws under the Fair Work Act. There's obviously a financial cost about the amount of time, money and energy that organisations need to then start investing to deal with the appalling or possibly dysfunctional behaviour that's going on. And yes, guess what? This stuff often doesn't remain silent within the realms of the team environment. It can jump, and there's been a few fascinating cases where obviously through social media and through email, whatever, LinkedIn, Facebook, the rest of the world can sometimes find out about what a team's culture is like, and obviously that place becomes not so much a place where people then wish to apply to work in. And certainly, obviously, when teams are functioning badly, there's obviously another competitor around the block who possibly has a very functional team who's able to take advantage of that internal chaos or dysfunction within that team environment. So, quite frankly, this is a real big banner. Feel free to print it out when you've got the PowerPoint slides to be able to show to anybody if they think that just, oh, well, that's just HR's business, or we'll flick it to HR, or we don't need to worry so much about how people travel as long as we get the job done. I would suggest that it's very much a basic core principle, any workplace functionality, that you need to make sure your team is not acting in a toxic way. So, in terms of, I suppose, you're thinking, well, that could never happen to me, my team's fine. Slightly alarming statistics about to be put on the screen. So, a study not that long ago indicated that across Australian workplaces, is that 1 in 7? I haven't done general maths for a while, but that looks like literally, 1 in 7, 14% of Australian workplaces, when employees were approached to ask, how would you describe your workplace environment, they came back with the adjective of toxic. 20% of individuals there indicating communication with one of a member of their team or their supervisor. Half the people indicated conflict or other negative conduct at work. So without wanting to use the word epidemic, I do think that is a really serious prevalence there from that study of, quite frankly, what is going on in Australian workplaces. My, I suppose, experience is also skewed because, as Michael mentioned, WorkLogic, we are often brought in to investigate allegations of inappropriate behaviour. We're often brought in to undertake culture reviews and identify how a workplace is travelling. So usually we get a call when something's not quite right. But I suppose what's interesting to reflect on this particular study is that it actually marries as well with other statistics, such as 1 in 5 individuals in a workplace will come forward and allege bullying, who have been bullied. 1 in 5 people who've been sexually harassed will come forward and say they've been sexually harassed. So again, this 20% principle I think is quite useful to think about. It seems like there's a bit of a 1 in 5 principle about who will come forward and say that they have been subjected to inappropriate behaviour. And the cost, certainly there's another statistic there in United States dollars, but I don't know, get out your calculator. Is that 20 grand Australian rather. So the cost of having a toxic employee on the payroll, and this is fascinating because it's actually what happens when you have a toxic team member. People vote with their feet. They leave the workplace. What that means is that when people are behaving in a way that's problematic, other team members may leave the workplace, and that causes a real business cost. Intel leaves the building, longevity, understanding of the business and how it works leaves the building, discretionary effort clearly would be leaving the building. People are no longer interested in working for that employer, and so basically time and cost to replace those individuals, it's been estimated that that can be quite a significant amount of money as of itself. And whilst people think, oh, well, isn't it all about building people who are fantastic and superstars and making sure everyone's a functional member of a team? Well, certainly, yes, that helps. But what's interesting about this study is that removing your toxic work from the organisation, dealing with that situation, actually bounces up the amount of benefit you get rather than actually employing a superstar. So really take action when you've got a toxic team member, because if you don't, you're hemorrhaging money. And when you do take action to deal with a toxic worker, member of staff, you're actually delivering a lot of benefit to your workplace. So I suppose in terms of what that might look like in terms of why it may be that organisations have toxic team members in their business in the first place, you're thinking, well, why? Why on earth does that even happen? With the alarming statistics, ask the question, why? Well, here's some factors, and I've brought this together just as a bit of an overall list, I suppose, to explore with you what are some of the factors that will affect why, in essence, unreasonable workplace behaviour occurs. And the word unreasonable, I use that because often, as you know, potentially, that's part of the definition of bullying, and certainly bullying can often be a prime factor for why it is that organisations are in a problematic situation. So, yes, there might be some workplace stressors, the amount of work that you're undertaking, the lack of support for your work, overwork. Workplace stressors like that can affect people behaving inappropriately. It may well be that your sector has a certain demographic that may or may not then lead to certain catalyst for inappropriate behaviour. It may well be that if people are coming from a workplace sector or environment which is very command and control in nature, or if the workplace culture is not one that traditionally has supported, dare I say, people skills, or emotional intelligence, or agility, or it may well be that there's a very much an unaccountable way for what people deal with issues of compliance. So that last or second last penultimate arrow point there, workplace compliance and accountability. What's the workplace culture that is encouraging and or not engaging with situations that are problematic? And to what extent do people have insight as to how they actually work together? To what extent are leadership styles and management styles themselves being rewarded that might actually not lead to appropriate workplace behaviour for all? So there are just some sort of major themes as to why individual workplaces can become problematic. And I thought it might be interesting to explore with you now with the first of our two polls. I've got mention there of current leadership styles, situations often relating to workplace culture. So I thought I'd bang those two together and ask a question for you about what do you think about? What percentage of workplace culture do you think out there is looking like they decide or the managers decide that workplace culture? So, for example, is it 0 to 19% of workplace culture is decided by managers, or is it more than that? Feel free to apply your thoughts to that poll. And I've got some
so I'm about to open the poll. Just to, no need to put it into the chat box, thanks. I will open the poll. There are a couple of comments there. I'm sure you probably saw them there, Grievous, regarding that. So my poll is about to close the chat box. So once we've finished with the poll, you'll want to bring the chat box back afterwards. Now these results are, this poll is completely anonymous. So go ahead and pop in a response and then click submit, and then I'll bring up the results. And then afterwards, when we finish the poll, just click on the chat icon and that will bring the chat box back. All right, we've got 20 seconds left. And the question is, what percentage of workplace culture is decided by behaviour and actions of managers? And we're getting some interesting results coming through. I just got one person who needs to click submit, thanks. There we are, thanks for that. I'm closing the poll. Here's the results.
Oh, okay, interesting. So basically, you obviously have done your homework well, because the research shows that it is actually D, that 70% of workplace culture is actually demonstrated by the actions and behaviour of managers. So if you have a bit of a look now at my next slide, absolutely, it's really 50% response rate from you, fantastic. So the majority of people thought that was the case. You're correct. So if you look at actually that little answer there, really what happens around here, what the culture is, what's the taboo, what's the expectation, what are the norms when people walk in that office every day, or workplace, factory floor, wherever. Basically 70%, the majority of any workplace culture is really, quite frankly, affected directly by the manager of the team. And just in relation to some of the chat that's been coming through, look, I would absolutely wish to clarify, of course, that not all conflict is toxic. I'm talking about unhealthy conflict. Conflict which is not respectful, conflict which is actually not in line with values. So I like to define healthy conflict as simply disagreements. So disagreements at work, if they're done and in a respectful and healthy way, that's fantastic. We don't want to have an avoidant culture, but certainly conflict which is problematic. It's where, I suppose, to use that metaphor about bows and arrows, it's when people are using bows and arrows. They're using barbed comments, they're using toxic words or toxic behaviours in relation to a workplace process or issue. They're wishing to deal with that, but they're talking about it and responding to that workplace issue in a way that's not healthy for the team and the safety of everyone in the team. So absolutely as well, someone else has written here, sometimes the manager does not view the person in the team as toxic, even though the whole team is telling them. Absolutely. There's some fascinating stuff we could be getting onto in terms of where the manager sits in all this. And how is staff who raised a question to address conflict to be labelled as toxic member? Yeah, so sometimes it can be shooting the messenger or people not wishing to hear, and that itself is often about what is the compliance mechanism, what's actually the culture of insight, and organisations need to be on a constant journey about raising people's awareness about where they can complain, ensuring that organisations treat complaints seriously, and making sure that before that the manager is in a prime box seat to make sure that the culture is a healthy one. So if we look and think about what, on the other hand, workplace managers can do to really improve culture, there's been some fascinating research which shows, for example, that, and this was a UNSW and ANU co-paper, research paper about 11 years ago, in 2011, explored a whole range of different workplace environments, and they focused on the fact that if you've got a manager who actually engages with staff, listens to staff, supports staff, treats staff as an individual, cares for staff, is interested in them as to how they can be fully utilised as part of the team in their own unique way, then you'll get much more discretionary effort from people, you'll get much more creativity, and you'll get a much less absenteeism rate. You'll get more presenteeism, less absenteeism, less time cost, energy, emotion examined in workers' compensation and management time, all chewed up with having to deal with that sort of destructive conflict, destructive negativity and issues of that regard. So yes, when managers are in the right place and working well with their team, all those wonderful things can then happen in a team. But of course, yes, we're here today to explore where and how workplaces can go wrong. And so in that regard, in actual fact, we at WorkLogic, we've actually, over the last decade, been dealing with thousands of workplace investigations into allegations of bullying, discrimination, ethical misconduct, discrimination, other breaches of employers' codes of conduct and values. We've mediated these. We've conducted culture reviews across all sectors across Australia and beyond. And we thought actually what we would do about a year ago is actually reflect and go, you know what, we're getting all these different dysfunctional situations coming across our radar. What is going on? What is actually you know, the majority of these conflicts look like? And so we actually examined them and identified that whereas, I suppose to paraphrase Tolstoy, when you have a highly productive workplace, as we saw before, it's going to become very clear what is the goal for success there. But when you have a dysfunctional workplace, there are a range of different ways, a multitude in a sense of different ways in which that can manifest. And if you're aware, I think, is this an urban myth, that there are 13 plot lines that cover off the entirety of all literary stories in culture, I would suggest that we at WorkLogic would suggest that there are actually 12 core dysfunctions that either by themselves or together can come together to really affect what is going on for that team. Certainly, someone has actually acknowledged there something about when bosses are only interested in how much money you can make them, they do not consider the cost. The expense of a toxic culture is a hidden cost. I would absolutely agree that we need to be much more clear and align back to managers, CEOs, the board, to indicate, quite frankly, that it is actually a hidden cost, possibly. It needs to be made visible, and conversations need to be much more clear about the true cost of what running a business is like if you've got a toxic team there. Okay, I'll put you out of your collective misery by telling you now what are those top 12 dysfunctions. So here we have them. And I wondered whether or not any of them might or might not be a surprise for you. So in terms of, obviously, very briefly identifying what that means, clearly gossip culture, people spreading rumours that are very destructive, toxic personalities where people are genuinely wishing to undermine team dysfunction, bad behaviour, so that's people behaving literally any way that might breach codes of conduct, yelling, bullying, physical abuse, whatever it might be, nepotism, where there's a lack of clear merit decision-making going on, or there may have been, for example, where people have had a sexual relationship which was consensual, but then after it's no longer in existence and it's finished, one of the individuals involved may actually not cope professionally and may treat that other person badly in the workplace. Sometimes there are power imbalances related to that as well. Skeleton in the closet, what I would call unfinished business. So I suppose the question is, what we would say there is there something that, quite frankly, you might have inherited? You might be the manager of the team now, but you know, there was something that occurred 12, 18 months ago that no one actually ever really dealt with. It's been causing all sorts of people to be distracted, losing faith in their team environment, in the culture, and it really needs to be dealt with. Or it might be that something happening to people outside the workplace, something very personal to them that is affecting their sense of commitment and their sense of whatever it might be, behaviour, emotional intelligence in the workplace, sometimes lack of diversity, what I would call sometimes you know, a homogenate culture whereby you've got a demographic that's not covering off a range of attributes. So it might be a particular gender, a particular age, a particular racial group. It might not have a range of sexualities there. There might not be any visible people with a range of impairments. All sorts of things affect and improve, actually, the creativity of a workplace. And the research shows the more diverse your demographic is, the more creative it is. So think about everything from, you know, Gen Y through to baby boomers and beyond. Think about people come from all around the planet and bringing whatever amazing skills and diversity of thought they have on dealing with problems in the workplace. Think about where people are coming from in terms of their education, background, all sorts of things that affect how people function in a workplace and what skills they bring. A diverse workplace will give you a much better understanding of how to grapple with problems. Anywho, the next one, manager style. So yeah, I think this might have been something that's been popping up in some of the chats, but basically sometimes, and dare I say it, we label this chapter, it's not them, it's you. It may well be that to what extent have we actually ignored the lack of skill set, the lack of emotional intelligence and people skills within a manager, so that they actually are not taking control, and to ensure that they are actually doing all they can to improve culture in the workplace. And sometimes it can be simply just a case of too much work is causing people to get stressed, too much working long hours. And I think with the statistic, something like if it's 55 hours or more a week, that actually is shown to be actually, quite frankly, toxic to health. You're more likely to actually have some sort of medical condition apply if you're actually working in that sort of overworked environment. Organised chaos, lack of accountability, where are people at, who are they going to? I find sometimes when I'm looking at workplace culture reviews, those dotted lines, who actually is your supervisor? Well, we've got 4 dotted lines. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Well, would that be a bit stressful, wouldn't it? Yeah, well, it sort of is, yeah. It can sometimes lead to people behaving less than their best selves when they're demanding things of their workforce, but there's no clear definition of actually who is accountable to whom. And unhealthy competition, where KPIs are very much about the widgets, churning through, making, dare I say it, how much money can you make compared to your team member, but not the how. How are you actually getting there? So I'm getting some chats there. Absolutely, people are saying they're spot on. Thank you for that. No surprises there. That's good. I suppose what's interesting in terms of the quote there from Luigi saying, I guess the current Liberal leadership change ticks some of these boxes. Well, quite frankly, I did a blog 2 days ago and I identified 9 of the 12 appeared to be of some relevance based on publicly stated material in terms of the current leadership change there. But what happens if the manager cannot work to remove the toxic element? Absolutely, we'll be getting onto some skills enhancement for managers very soon. In terms of, I suppose, that next statement, also inconsistency in responses to these behaviours, like high performers get away with bad behaviour and others pulled up. So yes, that would be, I suppose, bad behaviour going unchecked, particularly when people are seen to be a toxic rainmaker. So yes, the word is, or the phrase is, I haven't trademarked it, toxic rainmaker. So we talk about, oh, they're a rainmaker, they're great. Well, they might be great, that's fantastic, they're bringing work in, but how are they treating the team? How are they leading the organisation? Are they leading it in a way that's healthy, or are they actually toxic and unaccountable? In which case, again, that's a massive cost to your business and a massive risk to your business. So second poll for you all, was just curious, I suppose, to reflect, not only hearing back from you about whether you thought those resonated, these 12 core dysfunctions resonated for you, but whether or not you also had some thoughts on a poll there about what you thought the most problematic one was. So I think choose one.
So that poll's now open. So you've got 12 to choose from. And I'll get you to pop in a response there, and then we'll click submit. You've got 20 seconds to go, so you might need to be quick about clicking which one you want to choose. And then we'll close off the poll. We seem to have a front runner from what I can see so far. 10 seconds to go, and then we'll close the poll. Alright, so that's going to take a little bit just to calculate. There's another 15 seconds to go before I bring up the results. And 5 seconds to go, and then I can bring up the results for you. You can see what your responses are. Here we go. Here's the results now. And there we are. So if you draw your eye down to G, or the manager's style, it comes in at 35%.
That is fascinating. Thank you, everybody. Interesting that skeletons in the closet didn't resonate, or unhealthy competition, but certainly I would reflect back and say, absolutely, we often, when we're brought in to investigate concerns, disturbingly and sadly, quite frankly, sometimes it becomes clear as part of a culture review or as part of an investigation that even if it was not clear to begin with that the behaviour of the manager or their way of managing people was not the obvious front runner, it becomes clear that the allegations of bullying by a co-worker may have been aided and abetted or allowed by the manager being avoidant. And actually, in terms of bullying, 70% of cases of bullying involve a manager bullying an employee. 20% are what's called collegiate bullying, peer-to-peer. 10% is upward. And I suppose what I would find useful, I suppose, to comment on at this stage is that these dysfunctions are not in isolation. They bounce off each other, they contribute, and they further get exacerbated. So often when I'm brought in, it's sort of, dare I say it, literary reference coming up. You know, sometimes it's Act 5, Scene 5 by the time I or WorkLogic is brought in to say, can you help fix this toxic environment? Can you investigate? What can you do to improve the situation? And what we find is it started off possibly as a personal crisis that then wasn't dealt with because it might have been about someone's possible impairment or mental health. And then a lack of diversity in the team meant that people didn't know quite what to do with it. It then got buried as a skeleton in the closet where that was sort of badly dealt with in terms of accommodating that person's impairment. And then after that, there might have been people gossiping about it or people starting to then make fun of that individual. And again, at the end of the day, it was possibly the manager who didn't understand how to make sure that values were lived, that hard decisions and appropriate behaviour was upheld, and then from there you've got the manager style being the core issue. So I would suggest that certainly the manager needs to be the core person, and if you look back at that statistic, about 70% of the culture is identified by the team, by the manager's behaviour directly. Certainly I would agree, yes, the manager is really the person who might need to be the core person to focus on. And that's quite frankly why we wrote Fix Your Team. It's all about making sure that when managers read it, they can identify what is the concern. Is it one of the 12 that's listed in the book, and diagnose that for themselves? And if it's number 9, chapter 9, then they need to be able to get help to improve the way they function in the workplace. So, for example, as you could appreciate, every workplace dysfunction has symptoms that manifest. People can see it. Often they can see it quite clearly. So it may well be that if there are awkward meetings, people tippy-toeing around each other in the tea room, that there's gossip going on around the traps, behind the scenes, on social media sometimes, you might want to think about, you know what, I think we've got a gossip culture and people aren't able to actually have a meaningful conversation about change or about our culture. It's all going on behind closed doors, which is then harming team cohesion and actually could be seen to be a type of bullying in itself. Or it may well be that there are people who are certainly undermining and behaving badly. And again, interesting to see that both toxic personalities and bad behaviour going unchecked were two types of, 2 of the 12 which were identified as concerning. So yes, bad behaviour going unchecked and toxic personalities, both at 23%. I mean, that's virtually half of workplace dysfunction. Is all about individuals who are behaving inappropriately, and sometimes with toxic personalities really know how to do it well, identifying other people's vulnerabilities and then using them for their own personal political gains. Can be really distressing for those people who are at the end of that type of behaviour. And organised chaos, absolutely. Sometimes, for example, it may well be that that's manifested through some people doing too much work, other people not quite knowing what they're doing, and people not really quite clear about how they fit into the team. So look, each of the dysfunctions has some symptoms. The book actually sets out, if you are the manager or HR or CEO, have a look around your team, start garnering intel and work out which of these dysfunctions are happening. So identify the dysfunctions, be systemic about it, be rational about it. You might also want to look at, for example, if you do these, you know, your 12 monthly People Matters survey or your Pulse Check survey. Have a look at exit interviews. Have a conversation with other people who are outside the team. If you feel you're able to, have a conversation with stakeholders who engage with your team members to identify what they feel about might be something that's a bit problematic with what they're sensing from their own perspective. Whatever it might be, the book is actually a great tool, dare I say it, for managers to be able to come to grips and not be avoidant about concerns in their workplace, not think this is normal. This is normal for people to gossip like this, or this is normal for there to be a toxic rainmaker. It's not normal, it's not functional. The book helps build the competency and confidence of managers to identify what are the different 6 core themes to fix the problem, and I'll go into those in a minute, and then communicate with HR. So it's not just, oh, it's HR's problem or it's my problem. It's actually the managers working in tandem with HR to identify and work together a process to implement various solutions and tools to fix the dysfunction. So, for example, it may well be that if the only problem out of those 12, unusual, but say the only problem, everything else is fine, but the only problem is the manager's style, see Chapter 9, then I would suggest we put forward, here are the 5 core ways in which organisations need to uptrain their manager. Think about, do they actually avoid conflict? Do they know how to deal with unhealthy conflict? Or even if do they know how to deal with functional conflict? Are they just not able to cope with any disagreement? And if so, how does that then roll and play out in terms of the ongoing culture and levels of behaviour in the workplace? Are they truly present both physically and psychologically? Are they actually walking the talk in a way that's genuine? And sometimes when people hear this phrase, they go, oh, you know, well, workplace values, it's all a bit tokenistic. I don't really think that matters. Well, unfortunately, I think that's a reflection on the culture of that workplace. We all come to work with values. All human beings have values. Human beings come together in a workplace. Of course, there will be values in that workplace. The issue is to what extent is the gap as narrow as possible between what are the espoused values of the workplace and the lived values. And managers have a core, fundamental, ongoing role to set that tone right. Difficult conversations, so when we are needing to have conversations about behaviour, toxicity, bad behaviour, inappropriate behaviour, whatever it might be, does the manager actually have the skills to do that? And apart from anything else, making it very clear what their role is and the type of manager and leader they want to be. So certainly there's an example of a solution that you might want to think about in terms of rolling out for the manager's style. And certainly, for example, we provide training along with the book if people do want to have their managers given a half-day training session on those core key skills. Because what I would say is, and why we wrote the book, gross generalization coming up, but when people get made leader or manager, it's often because of their technical skills, their technical brilliance, or their longevity in the business. They've been around. People think, oh yeah, well, we'll just give them the gig as manager. They don't reflect or think, what are the skills that they need to be given? What are the skills that are all about these things? Emotional intelligence, being a true, inspirational, vision-led, reliable, dependable leader. And that sometimes comes at a cost when organisations then don't invest in their staff in this way and their managers, and then problems start occurring, as I've mentioned before, in those other types of dysfunctional lists of behaviours we looked at. There we are. So yes, I do get quite passionate myself about this. The manager is key and they need to be trained. So in terms of what we've identified at WorkLogic, here are, I suppose, the meta themes for how you might want to fix any type of dysfunction. So you might come across, you know, skeletons in the closet mixed in with nepotism, mixed in with lack of role clarity, mixed in with the manager's style. Those different dysfunctions may need a range of different fix-its, if you like. It may well be that as a result of that you might need to think about, hang on, we need to align with our values more. We need to develop leadership, and or we might need to deal with unhealthy conflict. And each of these 6 core themes have a number of particular tools that you can bring in to address that. For example, such as improving the manager's skill set, or it may well be another set of suite of tools. So we've identified 14 tools that can be flexibly employed to engage. So here, for example, another suite of tools that you might want to have your manager think about and engage and learn about how to do is, well, how do you actually have an important conversation? How does that person live the values? What are some micro examples and ways in which that can happen? How do you have a conversation about values that's genuine and not seen to be hokey or disingenuous? Again, for example, the team is dynamic. People come, people go. What are you doing to identify in your next hire the appropriate attributes, the interpersonal attributes, the emotional intelligence attributes, for example, so that they are the best hire that you can be to augment and further improve culture? It may well be that dealing with overwork, for example, you need to get onto that as a specific issue. So there's no one just set and forget intervention. The book enables people to have a methodology to identify the bespoke solutions once they've identified the particular problems they've got, and putting it through that lens and that prism of these 6 meta solutions there, the 6 meta themes, and then drilling that down into 14 specific tools. So that's really, I suppose, all I'd like to say about, I suppose, team toxicity, I could talk about it for hours, as probably you can appreciate. But in terms of, I suppose, anything else you'd like to know about Fix Your Team, certainly there is some information about Fix Your Team. Feel free to explore the website, and hopefully this may resonate for you. The book is a visible, physical resource you can give to managers to help upskill them, make them own that they are the core, and as people said, 35%, the literature says 30%, they are the core nub and hub of dealing with and improving workplace relationships and dealing with destructive behaviours. All right, so that's that. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts at this stage? Someone's got here a hilarious statement. Is passive aggression a dysfunction or a symptom? Well, I would suggest that passive aggressive behaviour is certainly can be a symptom of possibly a disengaged workplace where the manager's style is such that people are feeling like the manager's not listening to them, the manager doesn't wish to lead, so then people start behaving in passive-aggressive ways. So look, passive-aggressiveness might be a symptom of a dysfunction, but also passive-aggressiveness might actually be someone who is prone to that type of behaviour, such that they might be behaving in a way that could be considered to be a toxic personality themselves. So can be, I think, both a, dare I say it, dysfunction and a symptom. The book actually enables people to really drill down and look at intel, data, perspectives, perceptions, exit interviews, whatever else might be the data you've got, to think about culture generally in your team and organisation, to really be very clear and precise about what you think is the core dysfunctions. Okay, we've got here, do you cover how to support the remainder of the team with a toxic member? Absolutely, and that's about caring for each other, making it very clear how to walk the talk, how to make sure that you are supporting all your team. We certainly wrote the book so that we're able to actually ensure that managers, when they read the book, have got all sorts of practical tips and traps to avoid when dealing with intervention and planning their intervention, and realizing that the intervention will take time, could be a stressful time, but certainly realizing that there is a plan that they can follow. So in terms of, I suppose, one of the tools that I mentioned briefly at the start is actually how to conduct an effective workplace investigation. Because it may well be, if someone is behaving inappropriately, your policies and your code of conduct, your compliance regime may well dictate, if not suggest highly strongly, that you need to hold people to accountable if they've behaved inappropriately. So when we do, and if we need to conduct an investigation, I've actually set out now here, in the remainder of our time today, some 7 golden rules as to what it is that you need to be aware of so that you don't end up becoming case law. I've got here guidance from the case law. The cases are all about flawed investigations, where employers have tried to investigate allegations of bullying, discrimination, sexual harassment, and have gone that way left. They've gone into failure land as opposed to success land. On the other hand, realize, of course, that whilst fatal flaws can be really problematic, they can cost money, they can be problematic in terms of not dealing with the core issue, which is, did this person behave badly or not? They can certainly lead to people being reinstated, even though that it might be proven that they behaved badly, but because the process of the investigation was not handled appropriately, they are seen to have been unfairly dismissed. Reputational damage can also occur, of course, if these cases are in the public arena. So, on the other hand, thankfully, due to the Rogers and Millennium Inorganic Chemicals Limited case, you don't need to be a police officer. You don't need to conduct a forensic or criminal standard investigation. You just need to be aware of basic tenets of procedural fairness. So here we are, the 7 golden rules about what it is that you need to be aware of if you're conducting an investigation internally into allegations of inappropriate behaviour. So, and I will just give you a spoiler alert. Guess what? WorkLogic's written another book. I'll get onto that at the end of this presentation today, which examines this in much more detail. So feel free to sit back and relax, listen to what the 7 golden rules are. But if you are a bit more interested in identifying what they are in detail, feel free to look at our book. It's 353 pages of procedural fairness goodness. And here's some goodness. So we've got here the 7 golden rules. Basically, you may have heard of natural justice, but it's actually the hearing rule, the no bias rule, maintaining confidentiality during the process of the investigation and what that means, ensuring people have a support person if they wish to, identifying that the contradictory evidence phase where people disagree. I don't know, I didn't see it. No, I saw it. No, no, that didn't happen. No, no, it did happen. When you get that in an investigation, you need to think about what you will do next in terms of contradictory evidence. Also think about investigating promptly and in a timely way, in an appropriate way, and last but not least, actually being analytical and actually making findings based on the evidence in front of you. So that, in a nutshell, is the 7 golden rules. So with the hearing rule, which is the first rule, you need to give people upfront information. Basically, we're in this room, if you like. We're in this space. This is the space whereby, if this were to be proven, these allegations concerning you, the respondent, and here they are in all their detail, you need to be aware that there could be possible disciplinary processes and outcomes as a result of that allegation being potentially proven by the investigator. Details of allegations, be very clear, be very specific, number them, make sure they're not vague. There can be really some major problems with this. And for example, a problem occurred, and dare I say it, this was actually a lawyer who conducted this investigation. I'm an ex-lawyer, voluntarily, wasn't struck off, but in terms of, I suppose, where this lawyer went wrong, they basically didn't set out specifics. And if you look at those allegations there that were the case involved, well, when would you ask the question, did you not assist staff members with their work? What's the problem that's antagonizing the customer? These questions are fair ones from a respondent's perspective. You need to be clear about, on the 17th of July at 10:30 in the morning, you failed to help so-and-so with their work. You are the manager, that is your role, sort of thing. You antagonized, so-and-so, customer name, because you failed to respond to their email 5 times within a space of 10 days across the period January the 19th to January the 29th, 2018. Something like that. Needs to be specific. If it's not specific, the allegations are problematic and they're flawed, and the investigation is not reliable. Otherwise, interesting when people are in a bit of a crisis. So in this particular matter, the employee had been on sick leave. And I think he was basically had emailed his caseworker to say, look, I mean, what's the worst that could happen? I could go postal due to psychosocial stress and start taking those people that have hurt me. Someone basically panicked and thought, oh my goodness, he is going to go postal. We need to sack him immediately. They didn't actually ask the employee, did you say that? This was actually, I think, not conducted well. The investigation didn't happen. They just simply basically assumed that because someone had read this email and told the employer about it, that he was suicidal and was going to threaten to kill people. Because they dismissed him without investigating what his intention was or whether he actually had written the email in question, that was found to be absolutely problematic. And quite frankly, what they should have done was they should have actually made sure that they gave him an opportunity to respond to the allegations. So just be very clear about making sure that when people are exhibiting signs of stress or mental illness, you don't make assumptions about their capacity to participate, and you also make sure that you actually have a meaningful conversation with them. Be curious and empathetic. The second rule of natural justice, second rule, the bias issue can sometimes pop up. So make sure that HR or you, if you're the internal investigator, are not connected to any of the individuals. Make sure that you're not seen to be somehow involved behind the scenes. And also in terms of aftercare, relating back to dealing with a toxic workplace colleague, make sure that if you are the HR person, that you're not going to be seen to be somehow biased in the way in which you deal with the workplace issues after you've actually finished the investigation. And of course, sometimes people approach WorkLogic to conduct investigations as an external provider. This other rule, sometimes people as investigators can say some strange things in interviews. This person in the case there, Lowe's and Arthur, started basically giving feedback to the complainant about the worth of their evidence, agreeing that they thought that their evidence was true, completely not appropriate, and indicating bias, that they'd already closed their mind and thought they'd decided the case in real time to a complainant, which is not appropriate. Other people sometimes, dare I say it, shoot the messenger, and that was the case in the Poynter-Tausker matter, where someone complained about sexual harassment. Rather than being appropriately dealt with, she actually was victimized as a result of coming forward. The no bias rule, again, have a think about, again, here, an internal investigator conducted the investigation, found there was found conclusions that actually were contrary to 12 other witnesses. So 12 other people had witnessed what was the subject matter of the allegation. There was basically no assault that occurred, but because the investigator had a strong trust in one individual in the workplace who came forward with a different version of events, he believed that person as opposed to the witness evidence of the other 12 people. So very much be careful about even unconscious bias when you are an internal investigator. Think about the time, cost and risk issues involved in investigation. Have a think about whether you might want to actually outsource it to avoid any issue of possible bias being perceived. Confidentiality, we need to make sure that when we conduct an investigation that we are making sure we are discreet. People are interviewed away from the hoi polloi. They don't get to be seen by people, and there's not rubbernecking and people going, oh, what's going on in that room? We need to make sure that people are given that dignity, but also it means that people don't talk about the matter afterwards to people willy-nilly. We need to make sure that the evidence is not tainted and that people do not otherwise start talking about the evidence that they're providing. It can be very much a problem then for the investigator if it looks like, quite frankly, people have been at the watering hole of the primary evidence and trampled all around it. And so when the investigator comes along, it's very hard to understand whose recollection was their true recollection as opposed to recollection they've heard from 3 people after the fact. Support people, Rule 4. Really, this is really about making sure that for investigations to be available for people when they're in the interview, and they're realizing that sometimes for people involved in an interview, it can be stressful. So getting people or applying to say to people, you can have a support person, really just helps make sure that they're feeling comfortable in the workplace interview situation and that they're given that level of support by people. It doesn't mean that you need to have an advocate as a support person. It simply means that you've got someone there who can help be a moral support for them and can call for breaks as needed during the interview process. Certainly, it also indicates, in this case, Hayes against the State of Queensland, it's not just about support people and EAP, it's about being clear about when are you going to inform people about investigation. Do they need to give support about informing them that no finding has been found? This is not an assumption made that you're already, for example, guilty. It's about making sure that the respondent, as much as the complainant, is treated with dignity when allegations are being investigated. I mentioned before the contradictory evidence phase, and that really, I suppose, is about where individuals receive information that's contradictory to another person's information, different perspectives, witnesses are not agreeing on what they think occurred. You need to put it to the parties. You need to put it to the parties in a way that's meaningful, that gives an opportunity to respond to that information. You might need to do it face-to-face. You might need to do it by email. Have a think about how significant the information is, whether or not you need to really hear that person's response in real time to evidence that contradicts their own assertions. Have a think about whether receiving that information might stress people out. So do you need to actually give them advice and a warning ahead of time to say, look, I'm about to email this evidence to you for your comment. It's contradictory to what you've told me. Can you have your support person handy? Particularly when people are stressed and might not have as much capacity to psychologically cope with receiving that, it's really important to reflect on that. And keep an open mind. Don't just shut down an avenue of inquiry because, well, I've already met with the complainant and I believe that that's what was the case. And just because the respondent's coming up with some example about why they say they did something or some other explanation or rationale, well, I don't believe that, so I'm just going to shut down that that type of inquiry and I'm just not going to even proceed to explore it further. Guess what? That's what happened in Rizwan Ahmad Kohar and Bartcraft Systems. That case was where the respondent said, actually, I wasn't trying to misuse sick leave. I genuinely was sick. You were assuming that I used sick leave as somehow a way of actually attending the Christmas party, even though I was sick. It turned out there was an absolutely clear, innocent explanation as to why and how he had both attended the Christmas party and applied for sick leave, and the evidence that was indicating that that was the truth was ignored by the investigator at their detriment because they sacked the individual, he lodged a complaint, and it was found to be that his evidence was not considered impartially and explored by the investigator. And here are some cases about making sure that investigations don't go on forever. We need to make sure that we are prompt and diligent. Make sure that you record information. Make sure you explain how and why you've made the findings you've had. Don't interview, guess what? Don't interview people when they're drunk. There we are, just saying. So that's what happened in that first case. The investigator was aware that the individual was drunk and still continued to receive his evidence about his version of events around alleged inappropriate behaviour in the workplace. Clearly not a reliable source or way to investigate. Or, for example, have a think about whether you need a translator. Is this person's English sufficiently sophisticated so that they can actually understand the nuances of what is happening in an investigation? And in this case, the Shenghe and Peacock brothers case, a lack of a translator provided was one of the flaws that indicated that the respondents had no real idea about what they were responding to. That case also was found to be flawed. Now, with investigations, there are a number of steps that obviously need to be applied as part of procedural fairness. We've been looking at those. Sometimes they lead to people not having capacity to participate in real time. Support person might not be available. Witnesses might not be available. There might be scope creep that might lead to the investigation be broadening out. It might start off as bullying, but it might end up being also sexual harassment, for example. You need to think about making sure that you don't delay matters by 18 months here in the first case, or 6 months, or dare I say it in that last case, Dr. Falk, 2 years in total. So have a think about making sure you keep the matter rolling in a timely way and you don't lead to undue delays. And last but not least, make sure you are analytical and logical and that your findings of fact are defensible and that you don't make any preconceived notions about the evidence you've received. In relation to that, when you write your report, make sure you state, for example, who was interviewed and what's the evidence in support of the findings. This was an example, that case of the Wee and Townsville Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Corporation Health Services case where that did not happen and it was found to be flawed. Now, just landing WorkLogic Airlines flight for today. So thank you so much for listening. Here is, as I said before, our second book, which actually was written first, but now has been republished and re-edited and made up to date as of February this year, with some new, dare I say it, flawed cases of investigations that we have explored and set out in that book. So that's a 353-page book that sets out, quite frankly, the woe to go of investigations. So feel free to explore that too if you are interested. Just conscious of the time, does anyone have any questions about anything we've covered today? There's quite a lot of broad-ranging topics, going obviously from workplace investigations through to team toxicity, what causes it, the manager's role. Your polls were fantastic. Thank you so much for those. Does anyone have any questions at the moment? Hurrah, someone said, thanks, Grevis, a great presentation. Thank you. Oh, well, thank you. Listening is thirsty work. As you can tell, I can talk underwater. So there we are. All right. Well, thank you very much. And here is some information about how you can contact me if you do think that our book and investigations might be of assistance to you in your work, whether you're an HR or manager in general or need some assistance. Thank you so much.
Grievous, thank you very much for that, and thanks everyone for everyone's participation, popping in those questions and comments into the chat box. It was great to see. Thanks for all the thank yous that come through as well. That was terrific. There's a feedback form that pops open. Please take the time to fill it in. I'm sure Grievous would love to have your feedback, as would the Institute of Internal Auditors as well. It will pop open when you click the X in the top right-hand corner of the WebEx environment. WebEx will close down, and then in your browser, the feedback form will pop open. So please take the time to fill that in. That would be great. Grievous, pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day, everyone. Certainly look forward to seeing you in future Institute of Internal Auditor webinars. Enjoy, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.